Pandemic strategies. Think aloud in small teams to think alike. This project was planned over the COVID-19 pandemic when clinical learning was suddenly suspended for undergraduate dentistry. And there was this need to supplement clinical learning with clinical reasoning sessions during the pandemic in an online format so that the students don't lose touch with their clinical skills and are engaged clinically in an environment with a clinical supervisor. And was before the sessions that were conducted, an instructional guide was shared with the students. This instructional guide contained the step-by-step guide on how to perform a particular clinical procedure. And it also contained videos and clinical images to help understand the clinical procedure better. The students could go through this clinical guide before the first session with the supervisor. During the first session, the students answered 10 one best answer questions related to the learning outcome of that particular clinical procedure. And during that session, the clinical supervisor took them through each step while thinking aloud about each step, verbalizing the procedures using a cognitive task analysis method. The supervisor actually verbalized each step so that the student could understand what the supervisor was doing during that step or what the supervisor was thinking during that step. For example, I'm going to design my special tray like this so that I know that the labial frenum doesn't have any muscle attachments. So what I'm going to do in this particular procedure is to pull the frenum downward and forward. This was one of the example of a think aloud comment. After this, the students were divided into 4 small groups of 9 students each, and each student was assigned one step from their clinical procedure. Study material and videos were shared with the students. Before the second session, 4 facilitators for each of these 4 groups were standardized by a session with the first supervisor who thought aloud in the first session. Then in the second session, the students thought aloud in small groups. After the think aloud session for each student, which lasted around 5 minutes, the facilitator or the clinical supervisor gave feedback to each student. And the facilitator also graded the performance of that particular student in that particular clinical task. What this enabled was individual feedback as well as feedback on a group level. So, post the session, the students answered 10 one best answers again, the same questions before they did the first session to evaluate their performance. And finally, after this session, the student feedback was obtained for this session as well, for this activity as well. Now, what this facilitated was that the students were in small groups, and in small groups they had to decide who would present which part of the topic. So they learned the clinical activity as a group and presented in small groups, got more personalized attention and learning, got individual feedback, and the supervisor was actually able to assess the students in a large group as well. Feedback was obtained from the students immediately after this activity was conducted. The students found this method acceptable. They rated this method as good and very good. They said that this method stimulated them to look up the topic further. They found that the first session by the supervisor was adequate in providing them a good insight into the procedure. They found that adequate learning material was provided. They found the session effective to learn the specific topic assigned to them and the overall clinical procedure as well. And then we could always, from the feedback, we could also assess whether the facilitator was adequately informed regarding that particular session and was able to provide to the students, and whether they provided individual feedback to each students or not. And finally, the students wanted this as a supplemental activity to online case-based learning and other learning methodologies. Clinical skills. We collected open comments from students as well, and there were a lot of positive comments, and what we got to learn was that we need to train students and faculty to actually think aloud before we do further sessions. because thinking aloud as such or verbalizing the concepts is a skill that we need to build on. So we need faculty training and we need to augment this with other forms of learning.